Alright guys, M-Tech Guy here. Now the time has come to replace the rear shocks and the front struts on the little 1 Series, the E87 130i. Well, I say the time has come. The time came a long time ago because these shocks are well worn out. Still has the original sack shocks on that it left the factory with. Now normally, if you're lucky, you might get 60,000 miles, 100,000 kilometers out of the original shocks. But normally they don't wear that well. They're not bad shocks, but they don't wear that well. And the thing is, with shock absorbers, they deteriorate so incrementally that you don't really notice it. And then when you put a new set in, you're like, wow, this is what my car's supposed to ride like. So in today's video, we're going to take a look at replacing out the front struts. And once I've got that done, I'll do another video showing you how to replace the rear shocks. So we're just going to focus on the front today as an individual video. Now, to be honest, the factory suspension setup on these 1 Series don't ride that nice. They are pretty harsh. They handle pretty well, but it's pretty harsh riding. The shocks rely heavily on the bump stops at the top of the shocks and the struts. So when I first bought this car, my original plan was to upgrade all the shocks to Bilstein B8s. Would be much firmer riding, but it would handle much better. But to be honest, with the purpose that this car serves, it's just a good daily. I think it's going to be a little bit too harsh, so what I've gone for is the Bilstein B4s, so it'll be a slight upgrade over the originals, pretty much an equivalent without being too harsh. So I think it'll just be a nice alternative to the original Satch branded ones. Alright, let's take a look at the parts we're going to need to get the job done. Alright, so we've got our new pair of struts there. We've also got some new bump stops. The ones on my car are looking pretty beat up, pretty raggedy, so I'm going to get them replaced out at the same time today, along with the dust boots also. They're looking pretty baggy, the ones I've got on my car, so it's a good opportunity to get that lot freshened up. Now, depending on the condition of the additional parts on your own vehicle, like the rubber spring pads, got some washers that sit at the top there, and also of course the top mount with the bearing in it. If they're showing their age a bit on your vehicle, you might want to consider replacing them at the same time too. I'm not going to go to that extent. The ones on my car are looking okay at the minute, so it's just going to be the 2 struts, the bump stops, and the dust boots that we're going to be replacing today. Alright, let's take a look at the steps required to get the job done. Okay, so first up we need to get the front of the car up in the air and the front wheels off. Alright, so we've got our front strut assembly here that we're going to be changing out today. And if we take a closer look at this front left one, see we've got a bit of an oil leak on the go here, so certainly gotten to the end of its life, this one. And if you can just make out the bump stop up there, it's pretty squashed up. Now these look like they have been replaced at some point, which is not unusual on these 1 Series because they do get a good hammering, but it looks like some animal has cut a slit in these to install them instead of removing the struts and the shocks, sliding them on and refitting them. So he's taking the lazy approach, but unfortunately they don't really do their job properly if they've got a split down one side. But anyhow, not to worry, they're going to be getting changed out with our new front struts today. So basically these front struts are mounted by the top mount there. There's 3 nuts on the inner wing, and down the bottom end it's just pinched onto the steering knuckle there by 1 bolt. So there's not much holding them in position, but we are very tight for space here. So there's 3 different approaches you can take to removing them. Now first off, there's the ghetto way. We can just release the 3 top nuts, release the steering knuckle clamp, and then basically just push down the hub carrier, and that will release the top of the strut down, and then you just slot it out the steering knuckle like that. The problem is, doing it that way, it's still very tight and you risk damaging your upper wheel arch lip there, just trying to slide it out. So you end up having to put a bit of weight on the steering knuckle just to stretch it a bit to be able to give yourself enough room to get it out. And what that does, it'll put a huge amount of strain on these front lower suspension bushes. So it's a bit of a ghetto approach. Is it doable like that? Yes. Will it damage anything? Maybe, but it's not good practice. Now the second approach, rather than putting a huge amount of strain on them lower suspension and steering components, what you can do is just slacken the bolts for the 2 bushes there for them front lower suspension arms, the wishbone and the tension arm, and then you can just flex it down without straining the bushes. So the third option, release the ball joint for the steering arm, the ball joint for the tension strut, and the ball joint for the front wishbone as well. So with all them 3 removed, That makes the steering hub nice and free, gives plenty of room to move things about and get that strut out safely. So I've got a few bits and pieces connected to the strut assembly here. So we're going to disconnect the top of the sway bar, anti-roll bar end link, and that'll get our brake hose bracket out the way. And then around the other side here, we've just got a couple of sensor wires to remove also. And then next up, I'm going to remove the brake caliper to get it out of the way so we're not putting any undue strain on the brake hose there. So for the end link nuts, that takes a 16mm socket, and we're going to counter hold the back of it with a 17mm spanner. And we'll remove the two caliper mounting bolts. They take an 18mm socket. So now we're ready to remove the caliper and its mounting bracket all as one, but of course we can't hang it off the spring there because we're going to be removing the spring and the strut together. So to avoid putting any strain on this brake hose here, what I'll do is just remove it, and then I've just got an axle stand set up here, and we just place that out the way there. Disconnect the ride height sensor. They take a 10mm spanner. You have to counter hold that one as well. Okay, so now I'm going to slacken the bolt for the tension strut, just to be able to allow that to swing down without putting any strain on the bush. And this takes an 18mm socket, and the same, you're going to have to counter hold this with an 18mm spanner. Now to gain access to the wishbone here, to be able to slacken off this bolt just to get that to swing down as much as we need it, going to have to pull the wheel liner back a small amount. Took an 8mm socket, there was a plastic nut here, took a 10mm socket, and then there's two bolts underneath there. They also take an 8mm socket. And now with the wheel liner pulled back a small amount, I've got an 18mm spanner in there. It's just enough room there to get it in, and we'll get that bolt slackened off. Right, so next up we're going to release the pinch bolt there for the strut. That takes an 18mm socket, and I'm going to counter hold the head of the bolt with an 18mm spanner. We can now undo the three nuts there that are holding the top of the strut. These take a 13mm spanner. So now we can lower the whole assembly down and feed the strut out, but to be able to get it out of the hub carrier, we need to wedge open the wee pinch point there. Now I've wedged an old screwdriver down there, so that'll just give it enough spread to be able to get the strut out. Alright, so we've now got the strut fed out of the strut tower. Now you do have to be careful as you're flexing it down and feeding it out here. You don't want to cause any damage to the edge of the paint on the wheel arch there. Sometimes it's worth just putting a bit of tape around there just to avoid any nicks. But anyhow, now that this is down, we can now feed the struts out of the hub carrier there. Okay, so now that we've got our strut free, we now need to compress the spring to be able to undo the top mount so it's not under any tension. There's a nut under there. Let's get the spring compressed. Right, so that's the spring compressed, and that's now nice and free. So next we can move on to undoing the top nut. So I've removed the plastic cap from the top there. I've got a 14mm spark plug socket here, 6mm Allen key, just to counter hold the strut from turning while I undo the nut. And I'm using a spark plug socket because this has got this hex portion at the end of it, so I can get a spanner on that, and I can also get an Allen key through the middle to counter hold the shock. So that's the nut removed. And before we assemble the new strut, we just need to compress the shaft a few times. The old shock. Hello. And the new one. That's better. Install the rubber spring seat. Right, so I've been having a bit of trouble compressing the spring enough to get everything back together with this Bilstein shock. It must be a tiny bit smaller or shorter than the original one, and the shaft's just retracting back too quick to be able to screw the top nut on. It's only about 10 or 20 mil away, but I just can't get it. But yeah, these weren't cutting it with the new shocks. There were plenty long enough to get the old shocks out, the original ones, but I just can't get it compressed enough for the new shock. Right, I'm back and the struts are now fully assembled. Now unfortunately I couldn't carry out the reassembly myself due to the type of spring compressors that I had. So what I did is I shot down to my local dealer and I got them guys to put them back together for me. And although I wanted to do the reassembly myself, unfortunately this is just the reality of working on your car at home. Doesn't matter how prepared you are, sometimes you just come across a situation where you're going to stop what you're doing, reassess the situation, come up with a different plan. Now ideally, I would have liked to have ordered some different spring compressors, but it's likely I would have had to get them out of the States to get them at the right price, and it would have taken a week to get them here. And this one series, it's my daily driver. I just want the car back together. I want it back on the road, so it's just quicker and cheaper just to shoot it down to my local dealer, get them to reassemble it for me. So that's it. Welcome to the real world. That's just how it plays out sometimes. Anyhow, let's get these things back on the car. Okay, so what I've done here is just applied a little bit of masking tape to the edge of the wheel arch there, just to avoid creating any damage, just in case. So now we're ready to insert the new strut into the hub carrier there. So if we take a closer look here, you can see that we've got a couple of notches on the edge of the bottom of the strut there. Now these align in the slot where we've got the wedge, and then this tab that's welded on the side of the strut, this is just the distance piece. So once you slide it in there, you just want that sitting on top of the hub carrier, and then that will give you the proper alignment. So I'll gently feed this one in now. Make sure the cable's routed around the right way. Right, now that's fully seated. I can remove the wedge. Now we go very carefully, just feed this round. So I'm going to rotate the top mount here and just feed each stud under carefully. There we go. Okay, so now we can carefully lift the strut up into the shock tower there and align the 3 bolts on the top of the top mount, and just be aware they only fit one way round. And of course you've got the little locating tab there for your wheel alignment. So I'm going to lift that up and then just secure it with the 3 nuts. And we can see where this was positioned previously by the marks on the paint, so we'll try and align that pretty much where we were before. We use a 13mm to tighten them up. Okay, so that's back in position, so we'll just make sure that's still seated where it should be in the hub carrier there. And next up we can reinsert the pinch bolt there. Tighten her up. And reconnect the headlamp level sensor. refit the brake caliper. Refits the anti-roll bar end link and the brake hose bracket. Reconnect the cables. Right, so now I'm going to refit the wheel liner nut here and the screw there. So what I'm going to do next is reassemble everything over on the other side, and I'm going to remove the under tray here. I'll refit both wheels. I'm going to sit the car back down on the front wheels, and with the weight on the suspension we can then tighten up the bolts for the wishbones that we loosened off earlier. And then what that'll do is give us the correct angle, so we're not bolting it up or drooping down, and then when we put the weight of the car onto it and it moves, it's just going to load up them bushes. So if we set the car down on the front wheels to start off with, and then the arms will be in the correct position and the bushes won't be fully loaded up, and they're going to last a lot longer and work the way they should do. So we'll leave these two small screws out for now from underneath. Once I get everything assembled the other side, I'll get that under tray removed, wheels on, and then we'll go from there. Okay, so I've removed the axle stands, and I've now got the car sitting up on some timber there. So the weight of the car is now sitting on the suspension, so now we can get underneath, tighten everything up. Okay, so that's everything tightened down now, and I've done both sides. So now I can refit the under tray and lower the car back down onto its wheels. Alright guys, so there we have it. That's the front struts replaced on the little 1 series. So in the next video we'll move on to the rears. Now as always, if you found the video interesting or useful, don't forget to give it a like, and make sure you go and check out the rest of my YouTube channel for more BMW DIY content. Consider subscribing if that's your cup of tea. I'm MTech Guy. Thanks a lot for watching.